You are listening to the Necropolis podcast, which is brought to you by Jason from Goatcraft and Shelly from HateMeditations.com and Metal Legion magazine. Dinosaur! 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 Welcome to Necropolis. We're back in action. I want to thank Tyler very, very much for filling in for 2 episodes, the Samath and the Sacramento episode. So Tyler, thank you a million for taking the reins and keeping this podcast going while I've been busy with other things and having some adjustments to my day-to-day life with the new position and all that. Thank you, Tyler.
You're very welcome. More than happy to do so, but I'm also very happy to have you guys back.
Oh, you're so sweet. And we have the infamous Shelly. He is Papa Shelly or Father Shelly now. So how does it feel to be responsible for another human being, Shelly?
Exhausting.
All right. Yeah. So if you hear,
that's all I got for you right now.
Yeah. He's been dealing with the diapers and the vomit and the crying and all that for a couple of weeks now, but he does have a nice looking son baby now. So yes, today we are talking about Slayer. We haven't done a focus episode in a while, and I thought Slayer would be pretty good to just jump into, since I think we're all familiar with Slayer and don't need to do much research on them because, you know, they are one of the most popular metal bands ever. So just an anecdote, I got into Slayer back when I was 10, 11 years old. Right after I got into Metallica, I was listening to that Slayer, and Rain and Blood was arguably the album I listened to the most back then. But now as I'm older, I really don't listen to Slayer that much anymore. But I did revisit some of the older material and came to the conclusion, it's like, yeah, Rain and Blood is good. There's a few really, really strong tracks on there. Of course, everyone knows Angel of Death and the song Raining Blood, which I believe those are in Guitar Hero, which just made Slayer way more popular than they deserve to be. But I did revisit the older albums and the newer albums too, because I was just curious how big that new metal influence was with their later output. Yeah, I was listening to Hello Waits, and back when I first got into Slayer, back when I was a kid, it's like I appreciated Hello Waits, but it seemed really like the production and the riffcraft seemed really stuck in like a time capsule in the like 80s thrash movement, where it was just like a snippet of it could only have been created at that point in time. But the songs themselves for that album, I think they're a little bit more dense with composition. Like the riffs have more logic, and there is a flowing nature to them, and it seems more complete to me. Whereas Rain and Blood, there are some aspects where it feels a little disjointed, because obviously it's bookended by 2 of their most popular songs, and it's like, there's the song Jesus Saves and things like that, where this elevates the album as you're listening to it a little bit, but it just feels really bookended, whereas Hello Waits feels like a great just experience all the way through it. So I would say Hello Waits is probably my favorite Slayer album now. But then again, it's like I'm more into the extreme death and black metal now, and I really don't spend much time with Slayer. I've never been inclined to see them play live. It just looks like this way too big with way too many normal people that may not really understand metal on a really deeper level. It's more of their, it's like, oh yes, I saw Slayer in South Park one time, things like that, where they might just have surface level interpretation of what Slayer is. And of course, the satanic imagery and all that. And it was in the Hot Topic back when I was a kid. I remember seeing a whole bunch of Slayer stuff in Hot Topic, as well as Obituary, oddly enough. But I'll start with Shelly. What are your general thoughts on Slayer?
Yeah, it's interesting because, like, I definitely concur that, like, the Hello Waits, sort of the in from Show No Mercy into Hello Waits is like the peak of Slayer's like achievements in my view, especially Hello Waits. It kind of combines the elements of thrash such as they were in the mid 80s with kind of like Merciful Fate sense of like theatrics and occultist kind of melodrama. And that comes across really well in Hello Eights, and the songs are much longer, so they do kind of really kind of unfurl their riffcraft. Whereas on Rain and Blood, it almost, aside from the two bookended tracks, it almost feels like a grindcore album. The songs just blitz by one after the other in really short snippets of like hardcore punk influenced like metal. And I think that's really, the two albums kind of really define the two elements of Slayer, the two kind of Slayers, if you will, because there's the Slayer that exists in the popular zeitgeist, as you mentioned, things like South Park and the fact that they're a bit of a meme now as well. And that's kind of them as an artifact of like American culture more generally, sort of the nihilistic kind of parody, satirical kind of side of American culture, and Slayer kind of slip into that. And I kind of associate that more with like 90s Slayer, when they kind of attracted a lot of more, I don't know what you call them, Pantera fans, like just bold, tattooed, very muscly, macho guys who were there to sort of jump in the mosh pit, thrash around for a bit, and listen to some noisy music. And then you get the other Slayer, which is the metallic Slayer, the Slayer of Show No Mercy and Hello Eights, where they, and to some extent South of Heaven as well, where they have a more elaborate approach to composition, maybe some sort of catchier riffs here and there, but they sort of tap into the occult as well. And like that's also an indicative of how well someone understands Slayer, because like throughout the 1980s they slowly shed their references to Satanism and like theology and went more quote unquote realism, in a realist direction with their lyrics. And people often say that as a sign of maturity, when in fact the opposite is true in a lot of ways, because they kind of just became a one-trick pony after that, and sort of kind of played up to this reputation of like the ultimate like nihilistic American thrash band. And I think those two sides to Slayer really kind of like, they really demonstrate how well someone understands Slayer and where they're coming at Slayer from. Are they coming at it from a non-metallic background, maybe sort of through the groove metal, new metal kind of oeuvre, or are they coming at it from a more classical metal background where they're more interested in those elongated narrative structures and the exploration of like Satanism and theology as sort of metaphors for darker aspects of human psyche and so on. But I'm sure we'll get into that a bit further. But yeah, that's my sort of general take on like Slayer, the entity as they stand in the sort of popular imagination now.
I see. Yeah, definitely can, chime in on the lyrical content. And when I was a kid, those lyrics was like, what the fuck is wrong with these guys? When I first got into, I was, 10, 11 years old. I'm like, I was used to like, Metallica lyrics, which tried to be a little poetic here and there or have some deeper meaning, whereas Slayer was just matter of the fact, right in your face, here's, the dark and bleak reality. Of course there was a lot of the satanic, just I feel like, you listen to, a lot of it's just posturing, I think, honestly, like with the satanic imagery and, like just metal as fuck and just hail Satan and die by the sword and all of that. But I distinctly remember reading the lyrics and just being like, what the fuck is wrong with these guys? But I understand it's like, they were a more extreme branch of everything else that was coming out of the thrash scene in California, and they kept that extremity, both in the songs and the textures and the riffs being very, it's like a predator coming at you, and then the lyrical content, which shows the bleakness of realities. Tyler, what are your thoughts about Slayer?
Slayer is one of my personal favorite heavy metal bands of all time. Some of their albums are amongst my most listened to, like Show No Mercy, Hell Awaits, and South of Heaven, especially. When I think about Slayer, to me, Slayer is the first four albums. I will say that out of those first four, Rain and Blood is my least listened to. My personal opinion on that record is that it is the record that you could say hardcore punk or maybe crossover thrash always wanted to do, and Slayer just did it better than all of those acts. But to me, I know this is blasphemy to some ears, Slayer doing the best crossover thrash album is a downgrade for Slayer. There's some tracks on there, like you mentioned, Jason, that I think have that air of classic Slayer to them. Angel of Death to an extent, the title track, Altar of Sacrifice, which I recently learned is actually an older track that they wanted to have on Hell Awaits, but their producer said that he didn't think they should have it on the album, so they moved it on to Rain and Blood instead. I think that, of course, their historical importance should not go unstated, but I also feel that emphasizing that too much denigrates some of their contributions to extreme metal. I won't say that they invented the style of tremolo riffing that would later be picked up and advanced upon by death metal and black metal. But I do think that they innovated the use of it that became largely prevalent in those genres, especially on like albums like Hell Awaits, where you hear almost outright what you could call very early death metal riffs from for the first time, which I think is a huge advancement in songwriting for heavy metal because that tremolo riffing enables you to create longer flowing melodies. It solves the problem of sustain on a guitar where you could only hold notes for so long before they eventually bled off. Tremolo riffing allows you to extend the length of those notes to a much greater length. And I also think that while like as also Jason said, there was a bit of posturing and sort of antagonism to their adoption of satanic imagery. They did attempt to inject some depth into it too. The title track of Hell Awaits, for instance, there's the famous portion, pray to the moon when it is round, death for you shall then abound, for what you seek for can't be found in sea or sky or underground. That's actually a paraphrase of a passage from the book Dune by Frank Herbert. Which at their time the internet was not a resource, so it's not like they just Googled up cool passages from literature. They must have been familiar with the work to some extent. And even talking about musical influences, there's an interview from the Combat Tour where they were talking about their influences, and they brought up heavy metal like Judas Priest and Iron Maiden and Merciful Fate and hardcore punk. Also said that they listened to a lot of classical, like Bach was one of the names they mentioned. And the interviewer thought they were joking. He started laughing. And in the background, you can hear one of them say, "You think we're joking? We're not." But so it goes to show that they were at least, conversant with that style of music, maybe not at any sort of like studied level, but they did listen to it and it had some impact on their songwriting, which I think you can hear on Hell Awaits. Although I know that predominantly the influence behind the progressivism on that album was Merciful Fate, which had a somewhat similar but maybe less advanced progressivism to their song structures on albums like Melissa and Don't Break the Oath. But yeah, in general, I think Slayer's amazing. I love their records. Show No Mercy I listen to almost constantly. Hell Awaits is another regular listen. And then I also really appreciate South of Heaven for its very dark, almost nocturnal atmosphere.
Yeah. I think we would all agree, like South of Heaven is the last good Slayer album. The Seasons in the Abyss had some, catchy songs, but they really started simulating kind of the rock music template for song construction a little bit there. And, here comes the music video, and they're doing stuff in front of the pyramids, blah, 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 blah. Prime for MTV back then. And, yeah, the downward trajectory is very apparent with Season in the Abyss and, of course, Divine Intervention. I do like a couple of songs off of that. I did discover it when I was a young kid. And, but still, I definitely see the rot there in the album. And of course, I remember when Diabolos and Musica came out. I remember that. And I went and got it. I'm like, fuck yeah, new Slayer. And then I turned it on. I was like, oh, shit. I was like, this is fucking Limp Bizkit. And I hated new metal so much back then because I was diehard, real metal, like with Riffcraft and all that. And here I am hearing Slayer try to cater to the new metal crowd. And I remember back when God Hates Us All came out, I was telling someone, I was like, no, this is fucking new metal. And this guy was way older than I was. He was like, no, this isn't fucking new metal. This is Slayer. I'm like, no, dude, this is fucking new metal. Like, there's actual new metal tracks on that fucking album. And it's like, even back then, I had the discernment. It's like, no, this isn't a real Slayer. This doesn't have, riffs that seem like layer and architecture and all of that. It just seems like it's just, put some textures together and make it bouncy. And Tom Araya almost raps, here and there. So, yeah, there's definitely the Golden Arrow Slayer, which is, haunting the chapel through, or was it haunting the chapel? That's the first, Tyler. You should know this.
No, that was the
Show
EP
No
released
Mercy.
after their debut. Yeah, Show No Mercy was the first.
Yeah, Show No Mercy through South of Heaven is what I would consider the golden period for Slayer, and everything else is kind of just redundant and assimilating aspects that were external to the golden period, like the new metal and just cookie cutter templates and from rock or hard rock and whatnot. So any thoughts on like how Slayer did that downward trajectory, Shelley or Tyler?
Sure. I definitely agree with you that they adopted some new metal elements, starting with Diabolus and Musica, which even Kerry King admitted that was the case. Well, he somewhat admitted it. He said that he was angry about new metal at the time and was trying to compete with it. But he did say he regrets making that album. Um, but on God Hates Us All, I think those elements are still present. I also think that they were really trying to imitate bands that are pretty close to new metal, like tough guy hardcore, like Hatebreed, and then other groups that they were. I think maybe at that time they were really hyping them. Slayer was like Chimera. I know at one point Slayer said Chimera is the closest successor to Slayer in the metal scene. They said the same thing about Sepultura earlier. Um, but I do think that probably starting with Christ Illusion, their quality increased a bit, but nowhere near their classic material. It got about to the level where I would say it's a decent heavy metal album, as in like close to quality of like Judas Priest or Iron Maiden, maybe some of their middling albums. They kind of like stepped up to that level of quality with Christ Illusion and World Painted Blood and Repentless, which means that the only value in listening to them is, oh, Slayer sucks slightly less, which means I don't listen to them at all. Um, but yeah, they definitely had that kind of downward trajectory. I'm not too familiar with Divine Intervention, never really listened to the album much. But I think that, as Jason said, Rot really started with South of Heaven when they started incorporating more rock and roll aspects into their music.
I mean, yeah, it's almost like you can track it based on how much hair Kerry King had. That kind of logs the decline of Slayer. But I think what's also interesting, particularly of 90s Slayer, is when other thrash bands were kind of going hell for leather with the like commercial aspect, like making power ballads and trying to be stadium rock, and others were trying to sort of cash in on the Pantera, then the new metal buck. Slayer, although they did definitely do that, I wouldn't deny that, but they tried to maintain at least a semblance of integrity that the likes of Metallica kind of quickly jettisoned. And you see that in an album like Undisputed Attitude, which was like a response to pop punk essentially, because as we've already mentioned, Slayer were hugely influenced by early hardcore punk as well, and this new form of punk music was coming out that was essentially pop music, and it was being called punk, and it was getting very popular at the time in the mid 90s, and they were kind of trying to reassert that, like, no, this isn't punk, this is actually punk, what we're covering here. And yeah, I get it, but it also kind of smacks of sort of a slightly older generation getting annoyed at what the kids are listening to now, but also realizing they've kind of dried up, their creative well has sort of dried up a little bit, so they don't really have anything to do other than sort of create Slayer versions of what's popular, or else sort of cover music that they liked when they were kids that they think the kids should be listening to now. whilst that's not the worst thing a sort of has-been artist can do, like I said, sort of other thrash bands' decline was much more dramatic. It still sort of spoke of them sort of circling around and kind of losing their way in the 90s, and I think becoming sort of victims of their own reputation in a way. And I definitely agree, sort of by the mid 2000s, late 2000s, they did kind of get their act together a little bit more. I'm not so familiar with the albums sort of from the late 90s onwards, but I did listen to World Painted Blood at the time, and I do remember thinking it was a dramatic return to form, but also when the dip is that dramatic, it doesn't take much to kind of lift it back up. But by the time that was released, Slayer were very much like yesterday's news. They were, quite a bit older. Their best years were behind them, and whilst it's not impossible for older artists to come back and kind of release some material that really sort of grabs everyone's attention, I think it's one of these where it's like they've done enough. They've released some of the best metal albums, some of the most revered metal albums ever, and everything else is kind of surplus to requirements from there. So yeah, the decline was dramatic, but not as bad as some of their peers anyway.
Something I've been trying to wrap my mind around the last 5 years is general theory has come to mind, where I think it might just be guitar-based music that there's a lot of innovation in a band, and then they just kind of taper off, and there's a great decline in quality. Whereas in classical music, composers tend to get better the older they become. I understand a lot of it is they become more learned, and they're able to do counterpoint better later in life than they were when they were younger, and things like that. But in metal, it's very, very rare where you have a project that there isn't a downward trajectory. And everyone always talks about is like it's the elitist thing, just listen to the demos and all that. But there's some truth to the best quality being usually from the early material. Slayer's case, the first 3 albums. Metallica, same thing, first 3 albums. Granted, I know Tyler, loves Ride the Lightning more than Master of Puppets, but I think Master of Puppets is pretty good. But there's this great period of quality, and it's usually early on with most metal bands, and then there's a downward trajectory, and there's only a handful of bands who never had a very observable downward trajectory, like Beherit, for instance, or Samoth. You just interviewed John last weekend, I believe. And the peak for Samoth is like in their mid-career, which is really, really strange. It's like later, part of their career, they came out Godless Arrogance, which I consider the highest peak for them. So there are a handful of exceptions, but I think it has something to do with, just the youthfulness and wanting to be, the best in any given arena. Like, the early death metal bands in Tampa, they competed with each other. Like there was actually bad blood between Deicide and Morbid Angel, and they both believed the other band shouldn't exist back then. Like, this is my territory, my music's better, and they just kept pushing themselves more and more and more. And it was very youthful and all of that, just to come out on top and be the top dog. And then after that, there's downward trajectory. But in classical music, there really isn't a downward trajectory as the composers age. Any thoughts on that, Shelley?
Yeah, I would say that's because there's no such thing as like a punk classical composer. I mean, I know you could make an argument for Mozart being one, but by punk, I mean someone that doesn't know how to play their instrument or know music theory. Like to get to the stage where you are a classical composer that is renowned enough to get patrons and to do it as a profession, you need to be really studied, really competent at your instrument. You need to know the theory, and you need to know the history of the music that you're engaging with. And this was true right back to the Baroque era. Whereas with metal and a lot of guitar-based genres surrounding it, you can just pick up an instrument and go. And this was especially true in the early 80s when Slayer were getting going. Like on Show No Mercy, although it's a highly competent album, they were still amateurs at the time. They didn't know what they were doing. Like I remember an interview with Dave Lombardo saying that at the time he recorded the drums for that album, he like recorded all of the drum tracks and then recorded all of the cymbal tracks separately because they thought that was how you did it. And it was only after the fact that they realized that you can just record a drum take all in one go. But that's just an example of like Slayer, you can track their growing musicianship over the course of their albums, and that's true of most of the bands that we discuss on here. Hang on one second, sorry.
No worries. Yeah, I could kind of comment on that while Shelley steps away. I also think that societal pressure was different during the time of great classical composers. I don't think that mass acceptance was as much of a factor. You know, most of those composers, what they were aiming to obtain was patronage from aristocrats. They weren't aiming to make something that appealed to the widest audience possible. And so I think that whole audience appeal provides a temptation for artists today. Although I don't think that's the whole explanation. I think that what Shelley said is a big part of it as well.
No, different periods of classical music, different, things going on culturally, like with the Enlightenment, which brought about, Romanticism eventually. Music was very, very personal. You have to take in consideration that there wasn't TV, there weren't, a lot of distractions that we have nowadays where people spent time together and there's usually someone in the family who played an instrument. And like Chopin's nocturnes, like that would be distributed around, and it's like, oh yeah, I have a daughter or son who plays piano, and she plays Chopin or whatever at night. It's very personal for people, and it was more communal. In that period, yes, there were aristocrats that even the Wagner one bailed out Wagner, and he ended up banging the guy's wife, which was Franz Liszt's daughter. But yeah, there's different aspects to the different periods of classical music. Of course, a lot of it was through the church. Look at Bach all the way to Bruckner. There was a lot of church music going on there. Not just aristocrats, paying these guys, money to write symphonies and piano concerti and whatever for them. But there's different types of cultural aspects going on throughout the history of classical music. So
what's interesting now is like, so again, we talk about the difference between musicians making music in the 70s and 80s, and often the reason all of the artists back then are so distinct from each other is because at the time they didn't have much to go on. As we mentioned, like Slayer, they were huge fans of like early heavy metal, Judas Priest and stuff, and they listened to a lot of punk music. But they weren't sort of immersed in the material before they picked up their instruments and decided to contribute their own. And that's true of most of the classic metal bands. Whereas now we're almost at a stage where musicians, new musicians, younger musicians, before they start a project, they're already immersed in the history of metal. They're like well versed in all of the different strains and all of the like key artists. They know exactly what their influences are, and they're usually much more competent at their instruments now. Like the amateurism of early Bathory, early Slayer, just isn't really a thing anymore, unless it's like a consciously done amateurism deliberately. Most musicians that put music out now are really quite technically competent compared to like the standards of the early 80s. But at the same time, that kind of leads to a general sterility. People are too self-conscious of what they're doing, because metal isn't classical music. There isn't like a formal canon that you have to study. There isn't a body of academic music theory that you need to go away and like immerse yourself in. Metal would like to think it's like that, but it isn't there, because classical music is centuries old and it has achingly like institutionalized bodies of knowledge and like hierarchies and so on that people have to kind of navigate in order to engage with the classical world. Whereas metal is, it's still the music of amateurism, but it's trying to take on that professional edge now. Whereas Slayer at the time, much like any classic metal band, were just like, no, we can do it. We'll just pick up our instruments and see what happens. And
Yeah, this
an album like Show No Mercy happened. So
yeah, I remember I listened to a Jeff Hanneman demo tape where it's just him just playing guitar, right? I think before he even started jamming with the band, where he had all this really abrasive riffs and it was very feral the way he put it all together. And I know Trey Azagoff too, like he started playing guitar and then immediately started a band, so he wasn't really experienced on guitar, but just did a lot of covers and things like that to become accustomed to playing more complex things. And so yeah, it's like a lot of these guys, early on, they had only been playing their instrument for 6 months to a couple of years, and they're able to come out and generate all their classic material and all that. And whereas in classical music, yeah, there is a long period before you're able to do something like that. Yeah, there's a lot of study and a lot of refinement of technique and all that before you're even capable of going up on stage and performing a piece, whether it's someone else's material or your own. There has to be some forethought, like especially if you're writing your own music, which I don't think there's really any uh really wonderful classical composers today. I was listening to a symphony by Philip Glass, and I was actually listening to this thing. I'm like, I could write something better than this. It is so fucking sterile, not much going on at all in the music, and he's printed around as one of the best like modern composers. And it's really, there's nothing there like really digging into it. I understand like there's some charm to Glassworks and things like that and the minimalist school, but when it comes to his like full-fledged symphonies, there's hardly anything there. And I would actually say Penderecki, which is like a carbon copy of Shostakovich, would his symphonies blow away that Philip Glass guy. But anyway, just kind of contrasting, classical music to metal, and why they're drastically different in terms of how quality comes out. It's usually classical music gets better and better the older the composer becomes, whereas in metal it's the opposite, where the guitarists, they lose that feral aspect, which I think there needs to be a little bit of wildness, a little fury coming into that, little, untamed nature coming out of metal. And when musicians become tamed over time, they kind of lose that fire. So go ahead, Tyler. I know you want to talk about Jeff Hanneman.
Yeah, you brought him up briefly, and I was going to ask the two of you, Jason and Shelley. I didn't know how familiar you two were with the internal dynamics of the band, but speaking on Slayer's decline in quality, I know that after Seasons in the Abyss, um, that increasingly Kerry King took over composition duties, because I think it was partly because Jeff developed that necrotizing fasciitis in his, I believe it was his picking arm, and he wasn't able to play guitar quite as well. Um, so Kerry King took over compositional duties largely from that point forward. I also remember an interview with Phil Anselmo where I believe it was either Phil Anselmo or that guy from Machine Head, but one of the two of them mentioned how, and this is what brought this to my awareness, how the majority of the songs by Slayer that they thought were the greatest, that they realized this shortly after Jeff Hanneman passed away, were composed by Jeff Hanneman. And so I went and did research myself and saw that was largely true, that a large bulk of their early material, and especially of the better early material, was composed by Jeff Hanneman. So I didn't know if you two had any awareness of this, and if you did, if you had any comments on, I'm sure it's not like the whole story, but how, if the decline of input from Jeff Hanneman had any contributions to their decline in quality over the years.
Yeah, I always assumed Jeff Hanneman was the main figurehead writing the music. I just always assumed that. And I thought Kerry King, you look at Kerry King, you look at him and you would think he would be in a monster truck rally, not, raising hell on guitar. Shelley, do you have any thoughts on Jeff Hanneman being the main force behind Slayer?
well, yeah, I mean, I did know that. You can kind of tell as well by the way, like Kerry King's no Lars, but he is not afraid to kind of, shall we say, indulge in shilling the band a little bit. Like he's played with like some 41, and he does a lot of like commercial collaborations, and he kind of poses as the face of the band, but I think yeah, it is quite obvious, especially earlier on, that the most talented members were Hanneman and Dave Lombardo in terms of like the real engine room of like the Slayer classics. And Kerry King, although he's a charismatic guy and he was important to like the performance and putting forward the idea of Slayer, he wasn't the most talented member of the band for sure.
I know that Jason would take umbrage at this specifically, but talking about Kerry King's influence being deleterious, I did hear that once in an interview he was being handed albums by the interviewer to determine, basically to give his comments on them. And one of the albums they handed him was, I believe, Morbid Tales by Celtic Frost, and he didn't even say anything about it. He just threw it on the ground.
Ooh.
I don't know, like, you look at Kerry King, I just looking at the guy with the tribal tattoos, the long goatee, he belongs in a monster truck rally. And I thought I saw a video sometime of him like in a snake farm, all that. And I just picture him just chugging some Bud Light, out in the back porch, talking about, those darn liberals and,
Well,
all.
that's kind of what I was getting at earlier on in my opening comments. Like, you have the Slayer of the early to mid '80s, where not just the music that is grounded, it's thrash, but it's grounded in this occultist heavy metal grandeur, and they're wearing eyeliner and spikes and leather, and not that that's completely necessary, but it's indicative of a certain kind of metal band. But then when the Kerry King kind of takes over in the '90s, it does align itself much more with the sort of meathead, like tough guy, hardcore kind of thing. And you see if you watch live footage, you see the composition of the crowd change from a broadly kind of denim and leather metal crowd to a more of a muscle bound, short hair, tattoos, hardcore kind of crowd. And that kind of music has its place. It's not for me, but it's also it kind of took over the Slayer entity and turned them into something else. And I think that was kind of anathema to the more dark romanticism of the Slayer that we three kind of appreciate more.
Yeah, I guess a good way to summarize like the kind of personality that he projects is like if Jeff Foxworthy got into extreme metal, like a Peckerwood hillbilly guy, and not necessarily dumb or anything, just really kind of low brow with his hobbies, and not something that you would expect from a band raising so much hell. Is just
Who is Jeff Foxworthy?
Oh, he was a country comedian who would I forgot what his line was, Tyler. It's like, you're a redneck when
Yeah,
blah,
you might be a redneck if you most time urinate behind a tree or something like that.
you might be a redneck if your sister is also your wife, shit like that. Like, just really, really stupid fucking redneck comedy.
Okay, that didn't make it over here, so
Yeah, and I would see like if he was like in the metal, he would be a Kerry King type of figure with the monster truck rallies and all that.
Yeah, it's like Slayer lost their mysticism in that later period. And speaking about their impact on metal, I think that's interesting to note those sort of two different that dual personality of Slayer, because if you look in the underground scene of today, like the really underground extreme death and black metal scene, not commenting on the quality of all of those bands, but the bands that clearly are conversant with actual underground death and black metal that engage in all of the blasphemous symbolism and the diabolical symbolism. Those bands and the fans in that scene still hold those early Slayer albums in very high regard, despite the fact that that's a whole section of the metal scene that meant that a large portion of Slayer's fan base are entirely unfamiliar with. There's a large portion of Slayer's fan base that just looks at them as a sort of awesome, heavy, pummeling rock and metal band that have no idea what bands like, as a random example, like Imprecation are. or Profanatica or Nunslaughter. But if you look at all of those bands are still gonna be toting imagery from Show No Mercy, you know, making riffs and variants on the imagery of like the goat, the sort of Baphomet goat man on the cover, and talking about how awesome Show No Mercy and Hell Awaits are and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah. I think another attribute. Let's be honest. Slayer turned into a brand with Seasons in the Abyss. Then rather than a band, they turned into a brand. And a good instance, you know, microcosm of that is when they replaced Jeff Hanneman with Gary Holt, and Gary Holt was making stupid fucking headlines for like wearing a shirt that said "Kill the Kardashians" and things like that, where he's just being edgy just to make headlines and really nonsensical shit. When you're catering to like the mainstream pop culture in society, which is, you know, like reality TV and the Kardashians, and you're just insulting that. That is like the lowest hanging fruit ever. Doesn't take, you know, more than one brain cell to do something like that, and that's how he was making headlines. And I think that's, you know, definitely, you know, well after the period that Slayer became a brand rather than a band. But yeah, so anything like any thoughts on like Tom Araya being a Catholic and things like that, which is kind of antithetical to the Slayer. I know originally they started out being really satanic, and they kept like a lot of anti-Christian sentiments going on, and you know, throughout even the later years. But and they started focusing more on like serial killers, blah 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 blah. But what about any thoughts about the contradictory nature of the vocalists being Catholic, just being essentially a parrot, because he doesn't write the lyrics. He's just up there, you know, being a parrot. Any thoughts about that?
Well, Tom Araya had a little bit more influence on lyrics in the earlier period of Slayer. Later on, it was but the largest contributors were always like Jeff Hanneman and Kerry King, and later on, especially Kerry King. I never was too bothered by Tom Araya being Catholic, and clearly Kerry King isn't bothered by it either, which is, you know, surprising in the sense that Kerry King has always had the most bitter invective against religion. Like early Slayer's anti-religion was largely part of a kind of like demonic mythology, but later Slayer, where Kerry King had more of the songwriting duties, you know, his anti-religious position is just anger, a lot of it. You know, I remember somebody talking about it in an interview and saying something like, I just don't understand. Was he like touched by a priest as a kid or something? Um, but um, but yeah, you know, he having that kind of level of animosity towards religion has never made a comment about being upset that Araya is Catholic, which I'm not sure why. It leads me to believe that Tom Araya may be one of those kind of Catholics who says, "Oh yeah, I'm Catholic, and yeah, I believe in that stuff," but doesn't really practice in a devout way. But regardless, it clearly never influenced Slayer that much. And I remember that Tom's comment on it specifically when asked about it was, "Well, you know, um, I we make songs about reality, and there's dark aspects of reality as well as good aspects, and we cover both of them."
Yeah, I would. That's kind of the sense I get. Is I always assumed it was just his upbringing, and sort of seeing it more as an identity rather than as a practicing religion. And like, it might just be that early on it was sort of, you know, the theatrics of, you know, Satanism and the occult, and then it did get into more like the social commentary aspect of it, and that kind of weaves more into the sort of grounded realism that Slayer were dealing with. But I don't necessarily see it as contradictory to a thinking Catholic's beliefs if they're very fast and loose with their kind of religious practice. But yeah, as Tyler said, like Slayer's philosophy has always been we reflect the world that we see around us, or at least Slayer's post 1990 philosophy was they just reflect, you know, the world that they exist in, and they sing what they see. And yeah, that means that they will shine a light on the darkest aspects of organized religion, and but you know they cover many topics as well that are kind of, you know, indicative of living in sort of modern American society. So
Yeah, they were way more extreme than, you know, their counterparts or colleagues in the the big four that came from California, which was Metallica, Megadeth, and Anthrax. Those bands had accessible mainstream appeal.
Can I stop you just for a second? I know you know this, Jason, but just in case anyone puts in the comments, yes, we know Anthrax are from New York. They're not from California.
Well, weren't they part of the big four?
They were part of the Big Four, but you said the Big Four from California, and I know that you know this. I'm just being pedantic, but Anthrax were from New York.
No,
So,
I've always hated Anthrax. I bought was that album Among the People or whatever, and Attack of the Killer Bees, and I was like, this band sucks. So
Yeah, they're the worst.
yeah, they're
yeah,
definitely the weakest link in that. But
yeah, you would think it would be like Exodus up there. At least Exodus put out some good material, but yeah, yeah. So contrasting them with the big four, so Slayer is like 1,000 times more extreme than those other bands. So it's kind of interesting, like the melting pot of those concerts where you had, mainstream accessible, MTV bands, which granted Slayer was an MTV band too, but they're much more extreme. And, they would have blood raining down on them in their concerts and, huge spectacles that they would put together. Yet, a lot of the people there at the shows, it's like, they might have just their knowledge of metal just is from what they've heard on the radio. Um, do you guys view that it's kind of odd that Slayer was part of that touring package? I think it was really strange, just because of how extreme Slayer was, at least in the early material.
yeah, I think obviously the Big Four is like a marketing strategy for convenience. Like we said, Anthrax shouldn't be there. Like Overkill, Testament, Exodus, pick an American thrash band, they should be in Anthrax's place. But in terms of like their standing more broadly, it's kind of similar to Napalm Death in many ways, in that Slayer has currency well outside of metal circles. But when obviously, like the likes of Metallica and Iron Maiden also have that, but Slayer, as you said, are far more extreme. And I'd go as far as to say they're one of the most extreme bands of their standing, where you could go up to a randomer in the street and say, have you at least heard of Slayer? And they would say yes, whereas they probably wouldn't for a Morbid Angel or a Deicide. So I think from that aspect, it is quite odd. But I think it's just the fact that they were kind of picked up as a very early meme of metal in a lot of ways, and some famous comedians, some famous kind of personalities, just drop their name now and then. They get in with, as I mentioned, the likes of Sum 41. They get a few spots on MTV, and it is possible for a band that extreme to gain real traction with a wider audience. But as we discussed, it's another thing whether that audience actually understands the entity that they're engaging with. But yeah, it is worth commenting on how popular they are, yet how extreme they manage to sort of remain.
Yeah, I think that in some ways they were kind of in the right place at the right time, but also they really were pushing a form of extremity that hadn't been done before them. I mean, you could list bands that were influences on them, like Venom, but Venom didn't have just the right cultural placement and circumstances to push them to the forefront. Slayer being part of the thrash scene was they got spotlight along with the rest of the thrash scene as being the legitimate metal alternative to hair metal, which was at least a nationwide in the US, if not a worldwide to a certain extent, phenomenon on the radio at the time. And so they kind of got the same, you know, fame that all of those other thrash bands like Metallica got, not as much as Metallica, but still got some of that fame, but just happened to be the one band out of all of those bands that was pushing a much more extreme and dark image. And really, that's kind of to their credit that they were doing that. I mean, the scene that they influenced, like extreme death and black metal, that kind of stuff is commonplace in that scene today. It's just taken for granted. But before Slayer, that wasn't really being done. And in a certain sense, all of those bands are, in at least to some extent, indebted to Slayer for that being as common as it is today.
I would say, yeah. So actually, sort of to dive a little bit deeper into like 80s Slayer, mid 80s Slayer, um, it's interesting to kind of discuss what they were doing differently to comparable bands. Like you mentioned Venom, but we could also discuss like Bathory, Celtic Frost, some of the German thrash bands like Sodom and Creator and Destruction as well. And who else was I going to mention? Not Merciful Fate. But yeah, other bands that were kind of Possessed. That was it. Trying to push what was at the time like speed metal and heavy metal, mesh it with the extremity and aggression of hardcore punk, and then take the theatrics of like the new wave of British heavy metal a bit more seriously, turn it up a dial, and kind of see where it goes. But Slayer kind of marked themselves out, yeah, by being part of the Big Four, which gave them much more traction than the likes of their European counterparts, but also they they kind of lent a sense of aggression and conviction. I hesitate to use the word conviction because I don't want to say that like Bathory or Celtic Frost didn't play with conviction when they certainly did, but there was this element of like really kind of aggressive joy that they seemed to be taking in their music, whereas Bathory and Celtic Frost were more kind of romantic and dramatic and almost tragic in a way, whereas Slayer were almost you listen to Hell Awaits and it sounds like they're almost having fun whilst also being so evil and malevolent, which yeah, I don't think you really got in many bands at the time, and that's something that death metal in particular really kind of picked up on, is kind of this nihilistic revelry almost, and later black metal as well through the lens of kind of later Bathory and so on, kind of picked up on as well, is kind of taking this sort of bacchanalian madness to the point where you're almost possessed by it. And yeah, you really get that sense on like Show No Mercy, Hell Awaits, and Rain in Blood that's what they were bringing to the table when compared to many of their contemporaries of the time.
Yeah, it just dawned on me. So when I was a kid, I bought Divine Intervention. I know this album you guys really aren't that familiar with, but the album cover that you guys are accustomed to seeing is like the skeleton and the circle thing. Whereas when I bought it, there was a black cover over that with just Slayer carved out, and that was for people to carve Slayer into themselves, like into their flesh. It was like a little template for people to do that, and that it just dawned on me that's what that was for, which is kind of extreme. Is advocating self-harm, in major record stores worldwide. Any thoughts on that? People carving Slayer into their arms?
Yeah, it's definitely kind of part of, Slayer maybe didn't have as much of this as, obviously like Norwegian black metal classic bands did later on, but more than I think before them, Slayer had more of an attitude of flirting with the idea of, oh, we're taking this violence and this darkness seriously. And part of like a display of that was, sort of theatrical gestures like carving Slayer into your arm, you know. And that was, in and of itself, that kind of like theatrical gesture was a kind of a sort of a sort of symbolism or antagonism, meant to shock. But they opened up the floodgates for that, and really it was like a sort of kind of like a like a sort of what's the word I'm looking for? It's like you had a chain of events that was started with them, or largely started with them, that increased in velocity from that point forward of how seriously can we take this? How much can we actually like embody these things that, before us were just talked about in lyrics or just showed on album art? Like how much can we actually actually give across the impression that we actually do believe and live by like this darkness that we communicate in our music?
Yeah, I mean, the moment they decided to open an album with like, Auschwitz, the meaning of pain, the way that I want you to die, is like that's there's no going back from that point in terms of like trying to outdo shock rockers in saying like, no, we really mean it. We're sort of we're toying at the line, and then the artists that followed kind of wanted to take it that step further. But yeah, you're right to sort of describe Slayer as like opening the floodgates in that regard, and I think that's another thing that death metal bands picked up on, is sort of saying, right, when we're coming up with the lyrics and the themes and our kind of like thematic inspiration, there are literally no limits now. We need to take this as far as we can possibly go, and that's something that the bands just a handful of years later took very, very seriously.
Yeah, there's a few things that, Slayer's too big to cancel, or they were too big to cancel. For a long time, they had the Slayer Eagle, which I believe is, really common still to find in like record shops and things, which is looks closely to the Nazi Eagle, things like that, but they always in interviews, disavow that. It's like, no, we're just talking about the dark aspects of those regimes, and what happened in history. Rather than embracing, specific ideologies of those regimes. So yeah, they flirted with a lot of things, and it seemed to be just to kind of antagonize the public, like the mainstream culture, especially you look at, the anti-Christian sentiments. That was during the Satanic Panic, and Slayer just embraced that so much. And then you had the Nazi imagery and lyrical content. Then you also had like really, really depraved lyrics about Ed Gein and things like, or Ed Gein, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. And things of that nature, where you're talking about the sheer murderous psychopaths that would, do horrible things to other people. And they were unafraid to, tackle, those subjects and throw it in everyone's face. So it's like they're contrarian to the whatever the prevailing zeitgeist seems to be, and that's part of the charm. But also I think that's part of just the thing that a lot of bands, when they like Cannibal Corpse, just being shock value, it kind of takes away from the music. And you can definitely see that with later Slayer, with Angry Man, Kerry King, essentially being Glenn Benton as like, I don't like God. Ah. So any final thoughts about Slayer before we wrap up today?
Well, I think we need to discuss guitar solos and that time Prescriptor from Absu auditioned to drum for them and dropped his drumstick during the audition.
Yeah,
I don't know if you've ever seen that video, but
yeah, he looked like he was jamming out when Prescriptor tried out for Slayer. It was like, oh, look at Prescriptor go. He's having a great old time, and he was really into it. But I'm unsure why he never got the spot. But in regard to solos, I think Slayer was kind of negative influence on extreme metal and solos being incorporated in, because it was just random chromatic scales and whammy bar, and it was just really no real thought to it. And Kerry King is like, his solos, oh my god, if you could summarize what he looks like, being the Monster Truck Rally, tribal tattooed arms and goatee and Manscaped commercials and all that. He physically embodies how stupid the fucking solos are in Slayer. And there's a lot of do you think the solos actually add to the music, Shelley?
Well, this is what I was going to say, because we were discussing this before the episode, which is why I brought it up. And I think we haven't sort of taken a deep dive into like the structural aspects of like classic Slayer and the sort of their approach to crafting songs from more elongated riffs, which was novel at the time, but is commonplace now. But we could say something similar in terms of the solos as we could for sort of like Celtic Frost, in that their solos, they don't really go anywhere. They have no kind of melodic content. They're kind of just fretboard murder, but they do like raise the stakes as far as the drama and the chaos is concerned. And I think, I know Kerry King's solos are like a joke on like for YouTube guitarists now, where it's just an ongoing like running joke, but I do think they add a sense of chaos and a sense of discomfort to a lot of the music, additional discomfort, I should say. There's obviously not really anything going on in the technical sense, and sometimes they are quite painful to listen to, but I think they should be painful to listen to. I think that's what I like about them. I think that kind of puts me in the minority in as far as like liking Kerry King's soloing is concerned. But I think they do lend a sense of like nihilistic chaos to the fray that, like, yeah, really kind of when it hits right, it really kind of elevates the moment for me.
Well, there's a lot
You're
of
not
bands
in
who
the
kind of mimic
minority.
that too, like really knuckle dragging projects like Bestial Warlust totally worship that type of soloing and just nonsensical, just throw it in there just because it sounds chaotic, rather than having any like musical foundation other than just being uh, a venue to thrust forward more chaotic texture. And that type of soloing became so prevalent in a lot of really underground, death and black metal bands. You look at Trey Asgoff, there's a little bit in that in the early solos, but he's much more expansive. He's much more learned on guitar, and he's able to create, some meaning, the musical
Yeah,
meaning
no,
within
I'm not
solos.
saying that solos shouldn't have meaning. Obviously, like a sophisticated solo can add real content to a composition, but I just think there is a place for the Slayer approach that really does add something, even if it's not, hardcore concrete musical content that you can point to. It is just kind of random like wankery. I think there is a place for that, and at the time when Slayer started sort of innovating that, it wasn't as common as it was, and I think it does really kind of fit the kind of music that Slayer were making at the time. But yeah, I accept it is probably overused now because it is easy to reproduce, unlike a really sophisticated Morbid Angel solo. But yeah,
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, you're talking about noisy, chaotic, unstructured solos being painful to listen to in a genre of music, or at least especially if you're talking about the
I never
genre
said it was
inspired by
painful. I said it
Slayer.
was stupid. Like all the knuckle
Yeah.
dragging bands
Um, I
do
was,
that.
yeah, I understand. But, in a genre that like partly predicates itself on being unpleasant to listen to. But yeah, I understand where you're coming from. They could have like something that actually like advances on the development of theme, something like that. But my position on solos in metal in general is that they're largely unnecessary. And you, for the most part, with some exceptions, get two kinds of solos in metal. You get guitar wankery or you get chaotic noise. And while neither of them are ideally what I would like to see, I will take the chaotic noise over the guitar wankery. You may differ from me on that, and that's okay. But yeah, besides a few exceptions of guitarists that actually use solos to like advance like melodic development or advance like development of theme. And at that point, you have to ask yourself the question, is it really a guitar solo anymore, or is it just another like additional melodic development in the piece?
Well, do you like abstract in the abstract? Essentially, compositions are solos. Like you're weaving a story to tell in a composition. Solos are just like like a guitar solo is just a little snapshot, real quick. It's like flurry of notes. Usually it could be slower, like Celtic Cross instance, but compositions themselves are not far removed from that because you're creating melodic lines and you're just expanding them more than just that little snapshot. So in the creative realm, I think Morbid Angel would not be Morbid Angel without those solos, 100%. And I think those solos are very special, and they come from a high-minded place, musically speaking, very intuitive and very, wonderful. Whereas there is, what it really seems is like they're just jamming out and they were just dicking around, pretending to make solos, and that's the noise that came out because they didn't know what they were doing, that chaotic noise, and it has this layer. It's just okay, yeah. Here's your, the cool riffs, that go throughout the song, and then this really stupid, like flurry of chaotic, chromatic notes, and for no rhyme or reason, doesn't make any sense,
I
musically.
mean, you keep saying chaotic, no sense, whatever, but I keep saying that's entirely the point. Like that is exactly why those solos exist, and that's exactly why they have their place in the music of Slayer. Like, yeah, it's not as diverse and it's not as dynamic as some guitarists. It's not meant to be. It's meant to do exactly meant to give exactly the effects that you're saying. Fair enough, you don't like it, but I'm saying it has an artistic place within like the armory of Slayer's composition.
I'm with
I,
Shelley on this one.
I,
Yeah, I think that like Trey Azagthoth is a more accomplished guitar player, but I mean like I think the place of a Slayer solo, and I think this is intentional, is like similar to, you know, when you hear just outright noise being used and by like an ambient artist. That noise has no contribution to like a development of theme or a development of melody. It's there to create a certain ambiance or something. And that's the same thing with those solos. I mean, that makes it sound really like intellectual and artistic, but it is an ambiance they want to create, just an ambiance of sounding like a very chaotic, like stream of fire from hell is running by your face, which might be kind of juvenile, but I think that's exactly what they wanted.
Well, they were conforming to a type of structure that other bands were doing. Like you look at early Metallica, there'd be a solo, 2/3 into the song. And Slayer did the same exact thing. It's just they didn't know how to do solos. They just came out with this wankery. And I understand we're beating a dead horse here by saying it's chaotic and no rhyme or reason to even be there. But I think Slayer songs would actually be better without them. I think the focus on the riffs would be more for the general public, and you'll be able to tell more about what makes early Slayer really really special if the solos weren't there. But yeah, I mean, I don't think they're painful to listen to at all. I just think they're really stupid. So yeah. So any other final thoughts before we wrap up today? Tyler, I know it's your favorite band.
Yeah, that maybe not quite my favorite, but definitely one of my favorites. And so on that note, any final thoughts I have about Slayer is I think that regardless of where you rank them in the metal pantheon, I think it's undisputable that they have had a massive impact upon the development of heavy metal. But maybe in some positive and negative ways. But in the positive ways, a lot of what we consider the heights of death and black metal wouldn't have happened at least in the same way, without at least some influence from Slayer, whether it's directly on those artists themselves or on artists that influenced those artists. So I think they deserve some credit for that, as well as credit for creating some of the most playful and enjoyable, diabolic, demonic metal of their time.
How much was Possessed influenced by Slayer?
I have no idea. I think I read once that they said they were influenced by them very little.
Oh, really? Huh. All right, cool. Well, thank you for listening. Shelly, congratulations again for becoming a father.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Yep, and Tyler, thank you for holding down the fort past couple of weeks. Been really nice of you, so I can get some extra sleep and all that. Thank you.
No problem, man.
All right, and thank you for listening.
men, the priests I never know. To witness such a battle show of power overthrown. Angels fighting angels, trees still die by the sword. I need just healing on the side to get the one called Lord. The gate of hell I wait to see. There's no but faith to follow me. I can take a lost soul from the grave. Jesus alone soul cannot be saved. Crucify your soul, call on it, soon she'll follow me. This old damn that God fell asleep for me eternally. The remake of the dark gates, the same comes home. The demons feed the birds well, the devil feed the roam. The owners rooted up the night, there's 7 ways to go. Each year's in a burning hole that loses my control. Reason anything to save the dog. Satan sees the afterlife not fall. Stop the screaming ghosts, cry out to you. Take time and offer nails, your life is through. Praise the moon when it's round. That's what you shall think about. For what you seek for.